I do think if it's a one-score game, I think with Tennessee's loss, we are very close to, if the game is competitive on Saturday, Michigan, Ohio State, and Georgia are locks to get in the playoff, and we're determining who the fourth team is. And does that, if Georgia beats LSU, then they're out. If LSU beats Georgia, there's no way an SEC champion is not getting in. Well, I shouldn't say that. Like if LSU were to somehow lose to Texas A&M on Saturday, a 3-loss SEC champion is not getting in. Okay, but I'm assuming that won't happen. TCU, it looks like he's going to have to play Kansas State again. And remember, Kansas State was up 28-10 in that game before their quarterbacks got hurt. Okay. So, I don't think it's a stretch at all that Kansas State could win that Big 12 championship game. I think if the committee really thought highly of Clemson over Michigan or Ohio State now, they wouldn't be so far behind them in the rankings. North Carolina losing doesn't help Clemson. So I think you're probably talking about USC. So if the game, I think Bill Connolly at SP and Plus Analytics has it 28-22 Ohio State. I think if it's that kind of game, I think it's very likely both teams are still getting into the playoff.
So let's take a reasonable facsimile of some kind of chaos, but not a ton of chaos. We'll not make it ridiculous. But out of USC, TCU, and Clemson, let's say two of them are in the hunt. They've done what they need to do. Let's say USC loses, and so it's a Clemson one-loss championship team, and it's a TCU. Let's say they lose. Well, they're going to have to lose to Iowa State. Let's say they're undefeated. If they're undefeated, Georgia wins the SEC, which eliminates LSU, of course. Then you're looking at Georgia, TCU, Clemson, obviously the Big Ten champion. Or
TCU's not in that group. TCU's undefeated. They're in the playoff. Doesn't matter what anybody else does.
Yeah, so I'm just lining up the four that get in. Georgia, the Big Ten champ, and TCU. So it's Clemson against the Ohio State Michigan loser. And you're saying you're getting indicators from the committee.
Yeah, I think if the Michigan Ohio State game is close, then it will be that loser. Yeah.
Okay.
I do.
Steve, before we let you go,
don't you? Clemson's ranked 9th.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Because the one thing you have to know about this committee, there's a reason why it's hard to move from like 12 at the end, because they craft a narrative throughout these. That's why they do this weekly event for TV. It's not just for TV ratings. It's to craft the narrative that they want. Okay.
Sure.
And so if they wanted to put Clemson closer into striking distance, if they wanted them in the playoff, they would have put them more. They would have done that narrative to put them more into striking distance. They not only didn't do that, but they had North Carolina at 9-1, ranked 12th. Okay. Or no, 13th.
Yeah.
So it wasn't like what you could see they did for Alabama, where after Alabama lost to Tennessee, they found a way to put Texas with 3 losses in the poll to still give Alabama a top 25 win. You see what I'm saying?
Sure.
There's no narrative being crafted to aid in a bet Clemson here at all. None.
What's going to be interesting there is to see where Tennessee goes, because Tennessee still has a tremendous resume, but they've got this egregious loss, and they've got to keep them ahead of LSU and Alabama.
I agreed with that until I heard this afternoon that Hendon Hooker tore his ACL. So now, if you're the committee, you need a narrative to move Tennessee down and move LSU up. Because people forget, about a month ago, Tennessee went to Baton Rouge and named the frickin' score on LSU, right? Okay. Now you have your narrative, right? Because that's all this committee is. That's why we desperately need the expanded playoff with some form of a play-in automatic bid process. Because the entire thing is not a playoff. It's an invitational based completely off subjective opinions and data. All right. And so they need a narrative to not have Tennessee still higher than LSU and Alabama. Now they can do it. Hendon Hooker tore his ACL. He's out for the year. So it's not the same Tennessee team. Now you have your narrative. That's always what they're looking for, is a narrative, a credible narrative to craft the conclusion that they want. Clearly, the top 3 teams are ahead of everybody else. Now, maybe they'll shock us and say, I don't know, beating Baylor on a last-second field goal is not as bad as beating Illinois on a last-second field goal, and they flip those two. If that happens, then this, in my opinion, will change. I don't anticipate that'll happen on Tuesday, though. So if on Tuesday, if the top 3 are still Georgia, Ohio State, and Michigan, The committee is telling you that they think those 3 teams, there's only 2 teams in the country that have won the stat battle in every game this year, Georgia and Michigan. So the committee is telling you that those 3 teams are ahead of everybody else. And we're really just talking about who the 4th team is going to be. If TCU wins out, it'll be them. If they don't, and USC wins out, it'll be them. If LSU wins out, I think it'll be them. And then maybe the loser of the Big Ten, the Michigan Ohio State game is out, depending on if TCU's undefeated and USC. But basically, the 4 teams that are going to make this playoff are in that 6-team group that I just mentioned: Georgia, Ohio State, Michigan, TCU, LSU, USC. And maybe if there's total carnage, let's say Ohio State and Michigan, one of them blows the other out. LSU beats Georgia. They'd probably need Georgia to beat LSU. Yeah. USC loses to either Notre Dame or in the Pac-12 championship game. Then maybe you take a 12-1 Clemson at that point. So there are the 6 teams that are in a tier by themselves, and then Clemson, I guess, is your outlier. In case of emergency, you need one more big name program. Break glass. That's what Clemson's the emergency play.
Dabo would love to hear that. Steve, before we let you go, when you need to feel good for Michigan Ohio State week, or any time during a drab February or March day, and you're going on YouTube, what are some of your go-tos from the history of this series?
My number one go-to is the 1986 game, simply because the level of production quality CBS put into that game looks good for this era, let alone, I mean, we're talking, cinematic for 1986. The Rocky intro,
Musburger era Parsegan game, right?
Yes, the Rocky intro. I mean, the production quality of that game is phenomenal. It was a tremendous game. Bo became Michigan's winningest coach by winning that game. That was the game where Jimmy guaranteed the victory after we were undefeated, number 2 in the country, and got upset the previous week on senior day to Minnesota. So that's a must watch. A lot of star players in that game. Ohio State gets off to a 14-3 start with Chris Carter at wide receiver, and Michigan comes back, but it really wasn't Harbaugh that day. Even though he ended up finishing 3rd in the Heisman Trophy, it was really Jamie Morris just running over Chris Spielman that day. And then Ohio State missed a pretty makeable field goal at the end that might have won him the game. So that's there. 1987, of course, number 1 versus number 4. That is absolutely on the list. The 2003 game, which is the 100th rendition of the game, that was Keith Jackson's last game at the Big House. The introduction to that is pretty potent and powerful as well. And that, then last year was not a game, Mark. It was an exorcism.
Maybe I only take this approach because my team's won 17 of 19 or whatever the number is, but I actually sometimes torture myself and go back and watch Ohio State losses to Michigan.
No, I saw enough of those live recently.
Okay.
Yeah.
Steve Deace, Michigan Podcast. Always phenomenal stuff. Steve, we appreciate it. Thanks for being here.
You got it, guys. Go Blue.